Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of The Agenda. Today we will be talking about challenges for entrepreneurship in India, business freedoms, and economic freedoms in the business environment. Right? We'll be talking about key issues, though we won't specifically focus on, let's say, the methodology of that which is ease of doing business, but we would in effect be talking about the positives and the challenges that have emerged over the last few decades, especially since 1991. And to have this discussion on this topic, which has been very close to the Indian Youth Economic Association, on this topic that the Indian Youth Economic Association has been working a lot on over the last few years, to a cause, in a sense, if we might say, that we're committed to. I'm being joined today by two of my fellow trustees of the Indian Youth Economic Association. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Madhav Bharat Bhushan and Mr. Sarthak Garg. Madhav, very warm welcome. Sarthak, very warm welcome to you. Madhav, you're still on mute.
I said, hi, Ajay. Nice to be here.
Hi. Again, for our audience, Sarthak and Madhav are founders and trustees of the Indian Youth Economic Association and have been working with the IYA for the last more than 8 years at this point. So we'll be completing 9 early next year. So that's been quite a run. And to add to that, both have had incredible experience. I wouldn't say it sort of spans over decades, but they have their own considerable experience in their relative fields. Madhav works in finance, and Sarthak's key area is infrastructure development, right? Though both of them have had ample academic experience as well. Sarthak in the field of chartered accountancy and Madhav in the field of finance and business management. So very warm welcome to both of you once again. I'm going to begin with sort of the initial comments from both of you as to the key challenges to entrepreneurship in India. And let's begin with what you think about sort of the current regulatory frameworks, and specifically, perhaps if you'd like to add on something, the recent changes, if at all, in that regard. So Madhav, we'll begin with you on this first.
Sure. I think so. The first challenge that is there is actually organizing almost all sectors of the economy. Today, you have a lot of sectors in India which are not entirely organized, and that is posing challenges to entrepreneurship. Because I think all of us have studied from the beginning that unlike a lot of the developed countries, India hosts majority of the working class as entrepreneurs, not in service, not in anything else, but as entrepreneurs. And that is why, since people of all backgrounds are entrepreneurs, a lot of these sectors have been unorganized. So now, as the government is going about organizing these sectors, there is increasing compliance, which is obviously going to increase the challenges that a common man faces when he thinks about entrepreneurship.
Okay, so that's an extremely valid point. Sarthak, I'll get you in on that. That on some level, there's a significant portion of India's economy which is still in the unorganized sector. And at the same time, with coming of new regulations, perhaps an added barrier comes into place for someone who's, let's say, a first generation entrepreneur or someone who's sort of just starting out in the field of sort of creating their own business. So your initial comments on that, perhaps, if that is also, according to you, the key challenge to entrepreneurship in India?
See, the stance I have on that particular topic would actually sound a little harsh. I think if you are still struggling, if your number one complaint is that you have to go through a lot of compliances, you have to go through a lot of filings, in it, those are the monthly compliances and the filings, I think you cannot scale up your business to begin with. I think that's the biggest. But of course, there's a huge problem of unorganized sector being brought into the organized sector. Madhav raises a very well point there. We are now in like, I think contrary to popular belief, India is going through a radical change. A number of beautiful policies have come out, especially in the last 2-3 months. When you talk about the farm bills, the amendments that were made, There's been channels opened where corporates can invest in banks now.
Hmm.
Uh, there are a lot of opportunities when you talk about it. But of course, our challenges run much, much deeper. I am, I think I am of the opinion that our laborious court systems in itself are pretty exhausting for uh, well-meaning, well-intentioned entrepreneurs who are trying to scale up their business in a very ethical and a responsible way, and they end up paying a very heavy price, not in the form, if not in form of the penalties, in the form of opportunity cost by the time they're expending out in the courts trying to defend themselves. And the cost of starting business altogether, not only, once again, not only talking about the financial cost, the time that takes to go through each and every approval, the number of bureaucracies involved, it's a huge challenge. So of course, doing a business is never easy, no matter which country you are in. uh, but India does have some things that it can work on. I'm overall, I have a positive outlook on the.
Okay. So again, very interesting point there. That on some level, Madhav Sathik says that there is, contrary to popular belief, that's what he began with, right? There's a lot of positives there, and the positive that he sort of highlighted was, for example, the farm bill, something that we've talked about extensively in some of our earlier podcasts as well, has been okay. That these are the policy changes, right? For example, Satha brought up issues of, let's say, courts, right, in the court system. Now, very recently, I'm not sure sort of to what extent the both of you are aware of this, but very recently we've had the commercial courts and the commercial divisions of the High Courts Act, right, which is brought with a specific intent to reduce the timelines in suits which are of a commercial nature, right, which go to commercial divisions. And obviously, when there's a certain threshold of, let's say, the monetary value of the suit involved, it moves to a certain jurisdiction. And it's to be completed, every step is to be completed within a specific timeline. Now, which obviously is a good step in that direction. And Sarthak, to some extent, I guess, at least with reference to sort of commercial matters and suits involving commercial matters, that's one step, a positive step. Obviously, the implementation is still something that is happening and will continue to happen over the coming years. But Sarthak points out a very, very pertinent aspect and a pertinent challenge. And Madhav, that's what I want to bring you in. And he talks about, so he's positive on, let's say, the policy changes that have been brought to right. But at the same time, he says there is still a structural challenge, right? And that has been the central foundation. Sure, it's been about, let's say, 3 decades since we've had the reforms, right? It's been about 2.5 decades since the '96 budget, right? The changes that have been brought since. There is a certain bit of, let's say, the foreign direct investment thresholds have been reduced significantly, right? Institutional investors are sort of pouring in money into the markets, right? So these are all sort of positives which have been happening over the years, right? Over the last sort of few decades. But that structural problem, right? That structural problem stems from, as Sarthak very correctly said, right? That there is a fair bit of lethargy within the regulatory framework. Number one. And that's not something that's central only to India, right? That's the nature of bureaucracy anywhere in the world, right? That there's still work to be done in that direction. But my question here would be this: that sure, there's something that certainly can be done. What is it that is the most realistic way forward in this regard, right? Very often we see, okay, technology, sure, to make sort of things better, we will sort of get technology out there to everyone, we'll incorporate technology into our sort of administrative machinery and all. Sure, it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of sort of effort, resources, and the like. But what, according to you, is sort of the more practical way in sort of taking care of these problems? And I'm asking this as someone who's out there in the field, someone who sort of sees markets on a not day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute basis, and someone who sort of interacts with business leaders in sort of multiple fields across sectors. So, what, according to you, is the more practical way of dealing with, let's say, this lethargy within the regulatory framework, which to a certain extent, Sarthak says, okay, fine, there's filings, paperwork, and the like.
So, first of all, I have slight difference of opinion here with myself as well. So while nobody likes regulation a lot, but it is regulation that builds also which builds confidence. So the increasing FII flows in the country are coming in because regulation is getting better. Now, where we talk about uncertainty is where we that is the biggest challenge for an entrepreneur. That you're going through the whole cycle, you are investing a lot of money and time into setting something up, and there is not a lot of transparency, and there's a lot of uncertainty on whether even if you get the things right, in your opinion, if things will go through. So I think where you can leverage technology is in making the system more transparent. I think if anybody is entering any field, you take into account the amount of time that certain regulations or licenses take. So you say, okay, this license typically takes 6 months to come in. It's a fact. So you go ahead with that. You plan accordingly. But what you need to improve on is how well informed an entrepreneur is about where they stand in the process. So I think that is where technology can be leveraged, and I think that is where a major challenge of this increasing regulation can be countered.
Okay. Okay. So again, I'm going to sort of build up further in this. And Sarthak, I understand the point that we were on was not that sort of we're opposed to regulation. I think Madhav correctly says that on some level, regulation brings in certainty, right? That sort of goes without saying. Sort of good
He raises a
regulation brings in.
I'm sorry to interrupt you there. He raises an
Yeah.
excellent point when you talk about it. Like, of course, there's a lot of confidence that builds up in the market. The buyer himself is always very happy if he sees that the company that he's dealing with is properly registered, is of a certain quality, is of a certain designation. So that's always there. But again, as you were saying, we're not saying that regulation is bad altogether. It's that there's so much cross bindingness within the regulations, which there has been an effort by the authorities to discount that. BIFER, that's the Board of Internal Financial Reconstruction, and Sarfazi Act, these were all replaced by IBC, and we saw very much beautiful, much more uniform regulation, which unfortunately was paused due to Corona. But you have seen some developments which are purely very, very good and positive for market confidence and investor confidence. And
Again, yeah, I think I'm sort of principally in agreement with, sure. I mean, just to sort of to play on the technicality there, it's not like the surface has been done away with, but you're right, like the moratorium in Section 14 coming in, the IBC gets an umbrella sort of protection and it sort of prevails over others, right? And which has been more effective, at least. Sure, it's still in the initial stages. You're right. So much of it has been sort of paused. We hope it's a pause and not sort of a permanent stoppage. And I can sense it from both your smiles that, in a sense, that's what the country awaits, right? The country awaits that the IBC fulfills its potential, and to some level, there is a decent recovery of whatever quantum of funds can be recovered from the market and for the market, right? Because that's ultimately going to be the end goal there, right? The idea of insolvency by itself is not only that, okay, you let an end come to certain things, but also that on some level that leads to a new start with those funds, right? That's the ultimate goal, that economic activity is continued and it continues to be spurred. Which gets me to my next question, and that's the question of taxation, right? Now, that is something that both of you are also well versed with, both in terms of your academic backgrounds as well as um, certainly a practical approach to the field. Uh, there have been recent changes in terms of incentives, right? As Sarthik we were discussing before we went live, that there is this question of sort of the deductions in the sense of expenditures. And just earlier in the year, um, the government has sort of given an alternative to the taxpayer in terms of the deductions. If you don't apply for the deductions, there will be a higher threshold. On some level, perhaps the government says that we are willing to sort of say that, okay, you can pay taxes at a much higher threshold, uh, if you're spending more. Is that what the message is? That we want to spur consumption right now rather than to say that why don't you save over the longer term, a trend that we had seen over the last few decades. So Sarthak, would you like to come in on that first as to
Sure.
your comments regarding that change? I understand that we're moving more into the direction of sort of uh, with the broad macroeconomic
Mm,
principles governing the Indian economy. You're moving a bit away from challenges to entrepreneurship. But
mm,
taxation is still something that sort of businesses keep in mind. I remember Madhav saying that earlier, this is off the podcast much earlier, that he doesn't take into account uh, what the taxation rate is. If it's a good investment, he will make it, right?
mm.
But on some level, uh, it's always at the back of the head, right? So Sathak, I'll get you in on this first, and then I'll get to Mr. Bhushan.
Okay. So, firstly, talking about the taxation changes, you see earlier with the investment based deductions that were allowed under ATC, ATI specifically, where there were exceptions made for infrastructure projects itself, for solar projects and everything. You now see that if you do away with that exemption, you can pay tax at a lower slab rate also. You can pay at a higher threshold also, which is it's an option that's been given to you, and it acts as a double-edged sword in the way, in the sense. Have you ever questioned why do you need a finance bill every single year? 25% of what every finance bill is, they are always adding 25% of areas where they left some leeway, some
Sorry, I
loopholes were
think we're
left.
having some trouble.
People had started cheating, and there are some areas where people were taking well advantage of the entire system, and despite not cheating, they were not able to deliver the entire benefit of the deduction that was supposed to be there. So the changes that were brought last year, especially when it comes to the slab rates, they were an option to the entrepreneur himself, that you assess and you tell us wherever do you stand better, what would be better for you, and you pay at those slab rates. So it was that's why there was a lot of criticism in the media as well, and there was a lot of discussions going on. So that would be my view in the regard of the recent changes. But I think when we talk about taxation, we cannot talk about some very basic creative accounting that's done in a lot of firms where it's just a matter of the IRS officer that is in charge is making disallowances based on certain principles, based on certain judgments, based on certain uh, circulars that has been issued by the CBDT. That's the Central Board of Direct Taxes, and they have to apprehend to that. There, however, there's no back and forth. He has to do it, irrespective of which business it is, of what might happen to the business. So, as we were discussing before we went live again about Vodafone, where you said that there is a deliberate effort often by the officers where they're trying to fill the exchequer of the government at the cost of finishing the business itself, which is a very terrible idea when you think about it. But you have to consider that whether the intention from the beginning was flawed or whether it's a genuine person who was going through a business and is for some reason in a cash trap, is in a debt trap, or is in some kind of problems, and he can recover provided you do not pressurize him unnecessarily. So an example of that would be something that happened with the Coffee Day Enterprises entrepreneur who ended up taking his own life. You see those challenges in the world, nobody talks about it because these are hard topics. Nobody really wants to deal with these issues. So there's a lot of challenges, but the positive is that there has been certain improvements, very direct and very fast improvements and amendments that have been made, especially since this government is committed to that. Ever since we've seen, especially since 2016, what I've seen is that the loopholes that were in the knowledge of the insider community for a long time were straight away done away with, and people were told that you need to you do you actually need to step up and uh, deliver. You cannot. just keep on playing around the system and keep blaming the system for a wrongful deed that you have done. So that's the thing.
Yeah. Okay. So some very pertinent points there by Sarthak. Madhav, I'm going to get you in on this now, on the broader notions of taxation, right, and how very often also the market reacts to it. And we look at it more from an industry point of view and from a market point of view. That on some level, there is one approach where, uh, let's say, you increase the base, you increase the tax base, you increase the number of people that can be sort of brought into the frame of sort of paying taxes. And at the same time, the another sort of complementary approach is that you try to increase economic activity, and as a result of the increased commerce, trade, and economic activity, there is increased growth and revenue, right? Rather than saying that you will sort of up the rate or you increase the rate, right? This sort of goes back to sort of Econ 101 of Phillips curve, right? At what point do you sort of place the restriction and say, okay, maybe at 40% everyone's fine doing business, maybe 25% people are fine, maybe at 60% people say, listen, we might as well sit at home, right? So now that's a general economic consideration. So your views on that is to what extent taxation and the complexity of taxation. Right? I'm just sort of building up on what sort of Sarthak said. Right? The areas of arbitrariness, the fact that he mentioned that why do we have sort of that yearly change coming very often. I agree. I agree with Sarthak when he says that okay, the government is always in consultation with businessmen, with entrepreneurs, with even MSME sectors, right? But this with professionals even, right? Because there's a considerable amount of taxation going from sort of high net worth individuals, even with professionals and not necessarily business, right? Which sort of goes complementary with entrepreneurs. Now, your sort of initial take on that and how sort of that plays out, because on some level the complexity is also, it's not just the rate being high or low, that's one component, right? But the complexity is also something that adds to the burden of the businessman, perhaps contributes to the to a tax advocate.
No, I completely agree. There was an ongoing joke from the last 2, 3 years where they said that this government has been very good for chartered accountants because of the rapid changes. They've been kept busy and they are in high demand.
Mm.
So that's there. But I think this year the government took a huge step in trying to simplify taxation. Now you can always find positives and negatives when you compare the old tax regime and the new tax regime. No policy will suit all. But the good thing is when we're talking about, say, challenges for even entrepreneurs, a simpler structure is always better when you're starting out because like I said, when you start out, whatever exists is the system that you've entered in. So you're not used to what was there in the past. So it's a clean slate. Now, the simpler taxation of a minimum alternative tax is something that might appeal to a lot of entrepreneurs who, in the first 3 years, do not want to think too much about taxation or about compliance. They want to completely have it outsourced and without having to worry about it. Because what happens is we all get it outsourced, but then you need a very credible professional handling your affairs. Otherwise, a small mistake and ends up happening. It gets detected after years, and till then your penalty is very high. So that defeats the purpose of getting a
Yes.
professional in. So simpler
Yeah.
structure sort of helps you take your mind off these compliances and helps you focus on your core competency. So that is definitely a positive. Yes, like we have been planning investments for a lot of clients, or a lot of activity in equity happens because of some relief in the long-term capital gains, which was also changed a few years back. There was no long-term capital gains, and then it was increased to 10% beyond 1 lakh
Yeah.
per annum. So
Mm.
these changes will keep happening, and it was taken as a big dent to investor sentiment at the time. But now, not a lot of people talk about it. Then you have big changes coming in the dividend distribution tax this year. That has also been
Yes.
a negative for large investors, people who are
Mm.
reporting high income and who are holding a lot of shares which give high dividends. So it's
Mm.
getting added to their income. So it's actually getting taxed at a higher rate than it used to. So it's a mixed bag,
Yeah.
but it does simplify things for companies. Now we are seeing more companies are doing buybacks. So it's
Yes.
actually increased investment activity because a lot of buybacks have been regularly announced. People are going ahead buying those shares before the record date, and getting those small returns in the market. So it works both ways. I think you have to ultimately, whenever the change comes in, take it in your stride. Don't not crib about what has come in, but try and see what opportunity it sort of creates for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this you've hit the nail on the head there. And also with the initial point, I just want to sort of bring this up for our viewers as well. I'm guessing sort of Sarthak is also already aware of this. That just on the 28th of September, a new amendment was brought about in the Companies Act, right, by sort of way of ordinance, and therein multiple provisions, multiple sections of the Companies Act were amended to remove or decriminalize certain errors which are very often made, like you very correctly mentioned, right? For example, you have an employee, you have a manager who's sort of managing a particular part, and that's part of the regulatory compliance. And at some level, there's a mistake that's made, right? There are multiple sections. I think Section 118, Section 26, where sort of you had a sentence of sort of imprisonment of up to 3 years, right? Sort of fines going up in lakhs. So those provisions were there, sure. I mean, it's not every day that you see that happening, and the enforcement is a bit different. But at the same time, the fact that it's sort of been removed, and the fact that that sort of change has now been brought about, is to a certain extent a relief, if I may, right? For the lack of a better word, it is certainly a relief, right? So, but yes, I think we're pretty much in agreement there that to a large extent there is, we can call sort of things a mixed bag, but at the same time, sort of tangible change is almost always gradual. And I think that transition phase, if we might say that we are in that transition phase still, in that sort of period, which is sort of brilliant for chartered accountants, if I might sort of say that, the sort of facilitators of the commerce and trade, right? Advocates, chartered accountants, company secretaries, and the like. So I think that's something that is absolutely sort of on point. Which gets me to my next part, right? This is, I want to use it. This is an example, right? But it's not sort of only. It's not an exhaustive example, right? It's not only about the telecom sector, and it's not only about taxation. And this example is not only about arbitration either, right? So, and we've discussed this quite a few times earlier. This is an old issue in India, right? It's known otherwise as like the Vodafone taxation, right? And for our audience, for those who are sort of not aware, right? So, for after the Vodafone sale happened, that when Vodafone took over Hutch, the sort of holding companies in the Netherlands, and that's where the transaction happened. The Indian government said, listen, there is the sale that's happened. The assets are here in India. Obviously, it's an Indian company operating only in India. We need to sort of we need to get a fair share of the tax here, right? Which sort of Bombay High Court ruled in favor of the revenue, or the government. Supreme Court ultimately, Mr. Salve argued for Vodafone and sort of swayed in that direction. Then you have the arbitrations that sort of followed, and very recently we saw the sort of award coming in favor of Vodafone once again. Right now, the element that sort of gets us in here, right? For example, sure, this can be one case, and the government's trying to sort of fill its exchequer, and Sarthak, we sort of discussed this right at the beginning. But on some level, this is indicative of uh, the kind of message that goes out, right? It's just like Mr. Salve said earlier, that it's not just about one company. It's not about whether the government exchequers are going to get sort of richer. It's not whether there'll be sort of the consolidated fund of India, or generally the sort of funds of India are sort of going to be sort of heavier. But what is the potential damage to the country at large, to the economy at large, when there was sort of potential? We've been sort of hearing this since our school days, right? It's India and China, and that's the future. It's the dragon and the tiger, and the horse and the hare and the tortoise, and so those comparisons have always been there, and we've talked extensively about the potential, the amazing potential of India. And I think that this sentiment, or sort of such acts, even though isolated in nature, right? This is not about the industry. It's not about a particular thing alone, a particular instance alone, a particular case alone. This is about the kind of message that goes out, right? Where companies which are willing to, which are inclined towards pouring in funds, inclined towards investing in India, in fact, even building infrastructure or investing long term in India, are deterred. Right? They're deterred not because of the fact that there won't be a return on the investment, but deterred because of the lack of this kind of certainty. Deterred because, listen, we started off well, and then suddenly we see that this change will come at a later stage, and then we'll move into retrospective taxation in, territory. Right. So again, because we're on sort of issues of taxation, we're on issues of sort of this investment treaty arbitration, and sort of governments generally, I think the bureaucratic framework sort of stands on this. So we've had statements from the Attorney General, we've had sort of statements from the Solicitor General, right? And perhaps there is discussion that the government might sort of go ahead and challenge that as well. But Sarthik, I'll get you in on this first. That it sends out a bad message, and I think in the longer run, it's the Union of India which is at a loss by sort of going ahead and sort of challenging um, such awards.
Sure. So I myself don't know where I stand on this, but I will go on to say retrospective taxation is something that is done by a lot of countries. It has been done by a lot of countries in the past. So I am kind of neutral on the issue, but what did actually ended up happening to the telecom sector itself, uh, we can see, if we analyze the last 5-10 years itself, we have the results in front of us. There were a lot of companies that were investing. There was MTS, I think, at one point. There was Unionor, which was a joint venture between Telenor and a company, and they ended up uh, exiting the telecom business altogether. You saw companies like Airtel going completely bust. Because the credit lines were okay. This is another thing that does not come up when you create so much tension in the sector. The banks will obviously get a little scared. They will start to pause your credit lines, and at that point it's even harder for a business that's already struggling to revive and then fight back with those big competitors that are in the market to begin with. At the same time, you endanger the bank's money itself. There is very less probability that by pressuring him more, you will actually get more amount of capital out of them. It's much more likely that they might just divert their funds and run away, like Vijay Mallya did, like Nirav Modi did, like Mehul Choksi did. So we have kind of seen how it plays out in the last 8-10 years by our own eyes. But coming back to the real issue, what your real question was, it is definitely very short-sightedness by the government when it pushes agendas like this and topics like this. There needs to be a larger discussion about the opportunity cost of what it actually helped us achieve. And I think after all these years, I think the answer that you will get will be pretty daunting. So it's better to just leave it there. We can discuss about it, but yeah, it's nothing can be done about it.
Okay, so Madhav, Sarthak brings up the same point here, right? That on some level we look at the larger opportunity cost here, right? And you think that it's a decision or such decisions, right? This is not something that's coming up now, right? No, this has been an issue for the last decade. It's been an issue for over a decade, right? And this is just one example that I'm sort of bringing up, right? If the opportunity cost is too high here, would you also be of that opinion?
I do agree here because one thing we keep saying is that chase long-term value, don't chase short-term returns. And I think that is a lesson that the government is learning or hopefully has learned. And I think we've also seen very good Indian companies move out for more certainty, for clearer tax regimes
Hmm.
and to save themselves from the retrospective taxation. So Flipkart also, when they needed to raise bigger money, they moved
Yeah.
their incorporation to Singapore,
Hmm.
and that is one example of a great billion-dollar startup, Indian startup that moved outside of India. So
Yes.
I think this is something that the government, I think, is already focusing on, because ease of
Hmm.
doing business seems to be one of the top items in their agenda. But I think we're yet to see some big leaps there from the government in terms of, actually showing it in reality. I
Tangible.
think policies have
We,
started
we,
coming in.
we, yeah, we
Something
have to see the
substantial needs to
consequences,
be,
the tangible
yeah,
consequences.
we need
Yes,
to see
absolutely.
certain
Now
substantial
that
consequences.
that is a very interesting point, Madhav, and that gets me to the next point that I wanted to raise with the both of you, is the enforcement of contracts, right? Now, I did mention that we have the commercial courts and commercial divisions uh, Act, right, which has sort of come out about just a few years back, right? It's sort of still in the implementation stage, and it's sort of taking shape in our courts. It is being interpreted by courts. It's sort of and again, commercial divisions are being built up across the they're being set up across the country. Right? That process is still happening. Now, the key point about, and this has been, right, again, I don't want to get into metrics, and our idea, our discussion here is not methodology alone. Our focus has been very practical today. um, that's been quite a refreshing change, at least for me. We generally get sort of we had Kartikeya Batra, who was remembering you, Madhav, yesterday. Again, these are PhD candidates, Shara and Kartikeya, and they're sort of people coming in fields of law. So I do like the fact that, first of all, this is very the brevity of this conversation is something that's appealing to me on multiple levels, right? On that level, I think I have not been able to contain my excitement, but that's also the point on which I'd like to stress now, that enforcement of contracts, right? Sure, there's an intent with the Commercial Division Court Act that you sort of shorten the period in which that commercial suit is ultimately decided by that court, by that bench, by that division. But if you go back to these sort of methodologies, if you go back to these ease of doing business indices, and if you go back to whatever reports come out all across the world, I'm not saying that we give them all the weightage as some people very often do, but to give them some weightage, right? To say, okay, it's indicative of something, if not entirely. India as a country, this is not a comment on bureaucracy, it's not a comment on sort of politics, it's not a comment on leadership, it's a comment generally on our mindset, right? We incorporated the common law system, we incorporated the Westminster system, we got sort of judge made laws, we got sort of we got all of that from the common law tradition. But on some level, enforcement of contracts, something so basic, something so rudimentary to the carrying on of commerce and trade. It's not that we don't end up enforcing contracts. I'm sure that businessmen, in sort of the way sort of they interact, the way negotiations take place, the way sort of law firms discuss with each other, I'm sure all of that also plays a role in uh, because there's one interest that is to be protected on one side, so that's taken to the hilt, and on some level we don't see the good, valid contracts being sort of enforced the way that we would like them to be, as a whole, right? As a whole. So your comments on that, Madhav, whether you believe that is also the case and what we can do to sort of make that better. I think it's more of a mindset problem more than anything else. Sure, there are other aspects of it. I think we're moving on that faster track now, but I think on some level it's a mindset issue as well. What would you like to say?
No, I think it gives again people entering into any new agreements or any new contracts. Your enforcement needs to be strong,
Hmm.
because the basis of a partnership, for example, would be that given contract.
Yes,
And in
absolutely.
case of any violation, leave out the big firms which have lawyers on their payroll, which have big legal departments. A small and medium enterprise, a lot of times, will be more scared of going through the hassle of, enforcing a contract than, actually abiding by it. So you need to have an easy and fast redressal of any contract disputes to further sort of, this is actual ease of doing
Smaller.
business.
Yeah, the
So
smaller firm
the
should be able
focus
to
is,
do it.
the smaller entrepreneur needs it, because that is where the dilemma comes in of whether to take a loss when you've done nothing wrong, or whether to fight it out in court for years. So that is where it comes in. A big firm with a ready legal team, they don't care. Go through it very frequently, and it's just another case for them.
So,
So
Sarthak, that's a very valid point that Madhav brings up, right? For the
Sure.
larger firm, for the firm that can afford to go to war in that sense, if you might sort of equate litigation with that, just to enforce that sort of one provision in that contract,
Hmm.
it's possible, right? It's
Hmm.
sort of just it's business as usual,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But
Sure.
for the smaller firm, right, for the medium, for the small, the micro enterprise, they
Hmm.
their approach to things would be, listen, our incentives are stacked up a way that just to be able to get this one thing out, this
Hmm.
sort of violation of a contract that's been against us, to be able to enforce that, to get that specific relief, to get the damages, we
Hmm.
have to go through this entire process,
Hmm.
which might be detrimental to a larger growth, right? The
Hmm.
path that we're sort of setting on. And to
Hmm.
some level, that's the greater hindrance. That's the challenge to, let's say, a
Hmm.
smaller firm trying to expand, saying, okay, listen, I need to get big and I need to let this go.
Hmm.
Your
So,
comments on that?
so firstly, I don't think only small firms suffer there. A lot of large firms suffer there. Uh, I have personally seen out in the field out there companies that had to complete their contracts despite incurring a loss, and even after that, they ended up going to NCLT. They ended up going for liquidation, but they had a valid claim with the arbitration panel, which they were able to apply for only after they had completed the contract itself. So uh, this is not something that is plaguing the small manufacturer or the small entrepreneur. This is something mostly a lot of firms suffer for. I understand that large firms have a huge legal cell and they can defend themselves, and the promoter will pretty much go unscathed. It's a topic for another time. It's a topic for inequality and disparity overall in the larger term.
Sure. Sure.
Uh, but
I-
yeah,
I'm, I'm sure you have a copy of Piketty's Capital line somewhere around there.
yeah, but no company is immune to these challenges. So when
Okay.
you talk about something like commercial arbitration uh, panels being set up, it's it's only happening once the damage has been done. There needs to be, firstly, that's there. Secondly, what something that's been very discouraging that's happened is there's something that happened in IBC as well. Some new laws were brought in that came in with very strict timelines, and once the process started and everything felt like, oh, it might just get finished after all, the court ended up declaring that these are guidelines, these are not exact timelines.
Yes, absolutely.
This
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 is in the
happened.
context of the IBC, yes. So this is
Yeah.
the shall is
So
whereas may,
so yeah,
and these are guidelines and these are not, yeah, mandatory. Yes.
this also hurts the overall. This becomes a challenge for the promoter itself. And once again, I would like to. I think this is a discussion you cannot again have in isolation. There are a lot of
Yeah.
problems when you talk about just incorporation of a company or incorporation of a project itself. It takes around 200 days for you to like get the construction permits, and there are at least 34 authorities that you have to go through. That includes the tree authority, the storm and water department, there'll be the sewerage department, then there'll be the forest department. Sabki
Yes.
NOC,
Yes.
you need NOC for all of them. And
Mm.
I think, as Madhav also discussed out, what's the time that's required for stockbrokers and PMSs, uh, the prerequisites
so
that you have to complete?
Yeah, so a lot of the SEBI regulations now
Hmm.
there are certain requisites you need to complete, like minimum capital requirements, education, the kind of personnel you have. So after doing all that, incorporating a company, having professionals on your payroll for months before you get the license, so you can't do any business, and blocking that much capital to get a certain registration. So that is a huge cost.
Absolutely.
Now, like I said, that cost is also something you will always consider before entering into a certain line. But you should have certain outlook or certain updates regarding your application on an ongoing basis, because you are incurring, not, it's not a one time charge. I'm not even talking about the opportunity cost or the interest cost of the capital you've blocked. You are paying salaries to very highly qualified professionals for months before you get your certificate and you get registered and you can actually start doing business. So I think that is the issue there, and that is a big challenge. Although this is very good on the other part, like I think Sarthak also mentioned, that once you get the registration, it instills so much confidence in people dealing with your firm, that SEBI, so and so is a SEBI registered, say, stockbroker or investment advisor. So they are managing things in a proper manner. They are professionals, and SEBI has been superb in keeping a tight grip in the industry on regulation and ensuring that not many major crises are averted. So they've been very proactive, but it also comes at a cost, like I said. So
Hmm.
that will increase compliance if you need to be more strong footed in terms of your selection of intermediaries. So that will also result in a longer sort of registration and a longer,
So
what do you say, an incubation period.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, I think Sarthik has sort of placed it quite well. That he brought in that specific question about the registration and about the paperwork and the certification required for stockbrokers, because towards the end of this discussion he had to make a pitch that if you want your investments handled the proper way, if you want them to sort of go to the moon, as we say, and if you want to invest for the long term value rather than the short term returns, then the person to go to is Mr. Madhav Bharat Bhushan and Bharat Bhushan and Company for all your investment needs. So I think that's a pitch that we had to make today, and I think Sarthik sort of placed it quite well. And one thing that I do that I must thank the both of you for, and I think on some level that's the best part about talking to friends from the industry rather than merely those from academia or law or sort of other professions where there's more of an emphasis on theory, that we're sort of wrapping this up in under 50 minutes. That's pretty much a no-go for me and any of my other podcasts. So on some level, I think that does sort of indicate that businesses are willing to sort of do things at a much faster pace. And it's time that, as we say very often, almost at the end of every other podcast, that the law does end up following the merchant. Right. Thank you so much, Madhav Sarthak, for joining us. And this was indeed a crisp, but at the same time, a very pertinent conversation that we've, again, wanted to have for quite some time. And I'm sure our audience has had quite a lot to gain from this as well. Some final comments from both of you before we call it a night.
I'll let you go first, Sarthak.
Okay. So I think I would like to say that we are on a overall there. I have a positive outlook on the economy altogether. I have a positive outlook on where things might be headed from here. I think there's a lot of discussions that are happening, at least within the community, if not something that is mirrored online or through the news media. It's the continuous discussions are taking place. People are discussing opportunities that are in front of us at this point of time. Maybe due to some new regulation, maybe because there are just opportunities out there. I think every one of us have enjoyed the beautiful bull run that all the markets have had this year. So, but again, that's the markets. markets are very different from what happens in the
Markets.
economy, what's happening with the companies inside. So I'm positive about that aspect as well. People are like, it's called the Corona Kal, but I think a lot of people are realizing how beautiful it would be for them to actually manage their businesses by delegating more, by not being actually physically present there all the time. But uh, beautiful steps have been made by a lot of promoters. That's why it's so exciting to discuss entrepreneurship with you and the challenges part specifically. But to be honest, there are a lot of opportunities in the market. You can pretty much step out there and just start talking to people just to realize how vibrant the economy at this time feels. That would
Oh,
be my.
this is quite hopeful, we must say. That Sarthak can look at a silver lining in all of this. And he's right, at least the bull run's been there for a while, right? So, Madhav, I'd like you to have the last comment.
Yeah, sure. So, see, discussion is healthy, cribbing is useless. And I
Yeah.
think that is how you have to take all regulation and challenges because once something comes in, it has come in. So either you can go on cribbing about it for days, but now you have to comply. So I think that is something that I have learned. And beyond that, I personally like the fact that there are challenges to being an entrepreneur because that limits entry into any given field.
Ah,
I don't know if you remember, whenever we used to have a huge course to study for any exam, I used to be personally happy because then the examiner or the person who sets the question paper rather will never go into a lot of depth. So you actually could skim through and still get score well. Or if you were graded on a curve, the more difficult the exam, the easier it was for you to get a higher grade. So similarly, the more difficult the regulatory environment and compliance around your business is, the more difficult it is also for your competitors. So it is the wise business decision is to use it to your advantage. So that is
yes.
my take on any challenges that you face as an entrepreneur.
I think it's a brilliant note to end this discussion on. Thank you so much, Madhav. Thank you, Sarthak. And I think that's the note, that's the takeaway moment for today's discussion. As Mr. Madhav Bharat Bhushan puts it, the obstacle is the path. Right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. Thank you so much, Sarthak, Madhav. Good night. Take care.
Thank you guys. Take care.